After dinner, the emperor received all his suite in his chamber. He was in bed, and he began to talk of the little faith he placed in the virtue of medicine. He observed that he used to support his opinions on this subject with such strong arguments that Corvisar and other celebrated physicians could but feebly refute him, and seemed to oppose him merely for the sake of maintaining the honor of the profession. The 30th. The emperor was no better today, and his periodical attack of fever returned at the usual hour. He was troubled with pimples on his lips and in his mouth, together with a sore throat, so that he felt pain in speaking and imminent swallowing. When the doctor came in the evening, he brought with him a gargle for the emperor's throat, but it was with difficulty we prevailed on him to use it. There is no oil to be procured fit for the emperor's use. It is execrable, and he is very fastidious. In the course of conversation today, the emperor, in alluding to the extravagance of the debts of Josephine, mentioned that he himself, though the most regular man in the world with respect to money matters, once got into an unpleasant predicament at St. Cloud. I was riding in my calash, said he, along with the empress, when amidst an immense crowd of people I was accosted in the Eastern style, as a sultan might be addressed on his way to the mosque, by one of my tradesmen, who demanded a considerable sum of money, the payment of which had been for a long time withheld from him. The man's demand was just, remarked Napoleon, and yet I was not to blame. I had paid the money at the proper time. The intermediate agent was solely at fault. At another time, when alluding to the unpopularity of which he said he had latterly been the object, I expressed my surprise that he had not endeavored to countermine the libels that were published against him and to recover public favor. To this he replied with an air of inspiration, I had higher objects in view than to concern myself about flattering and courting a petty multitude, a few insignificant coteries and sects. I should have returned victorious from Moscow, and then not only these people, but all France and all the world would have admired and blessed me. I might then have withdrawn myself mysteriously from the world, and popular credulity would have revived the fable of Romulus. It would have been said that I had been carried up to heaven to take my place among the gods. About 7 o'clock, the emperor, finding himself very weak, retired to bed. When our dinner was ended, he received us all in his chamber, as he did yesterday, his bed curtains being drawn. After a little desultory conversation, he took a fancy to have Robinson Crusoe read to him. Each of the gentlemen read a portion by turns, I alone being exempt on account of my bad eyes. After an hour or two spent in this way, the emperor took leave of us all, except the youngest of the party, General Gourgaud, whom he detained for the purpose of reading and conversing with him a little longer. The 31st. Fair weather had now returned. The day was delightful. The emperor had kept his chamber for 6 days, and tired of the monotony of the scene, he determined to disobey the doctor's orders. He went out, but felt himself so extremely weak that he was scarce able to walk. He ordered the calash, and we took a drive. He was silent and low-spirited, and suffered from considerable pain, particularly from the soreness of his mouth. Shortly after his return, he desired me to attend him in his chamber. He felt very weak and drowsy. I prevailed on him to count a little, and he also took a glass of wine, which he said somewhat revived him, and he found himself better. He then entered into conversation. As soon as I set foot in Italy, said he, I wrought a change in the manners, sentiments, and language of our revolution. I did not shoot the emigrants. I protected the priests and abolished those institutions and festivals which were calculated to disgrace us. In so doing, I was not guided by caprice, but by reason and equity, those two bases of superior policy. For example, continued he, addressing himself to an individual present, if the anniversary of the king's death had always been celebrated, you would never have had an opportunity for rallying. The emperor remarked that he himself was the first who applied to France in the name of the great nation, and certainly, said he, she justified the distinction in the eyes of the prostrate world. Then, after a short pause, he added, and she will yet deserve and retain that proud title. if her national character should again rise to a level with her physical advantages and her moral resources. On another occasion, speaking of a person to whom he was much attached, he said, "His character resembles that of the cow, gentle and placid in all things, except where his children are concerned. If anyone meddle with them, his horns are immediately thrust forward, and he may be roused to a pitch of fury." Speaking of another individual who had passed his 30th year, and whom he happened to say was too young, he observed, "And yet at that age I had made all my conquests, and I ruled the world. I had laid the revolutionary storm, amalgamated hostile parties, rallied a nation, established a government and an empire. In short, I wanted only the title of emperor. I have, it must be confused," added he, "been the spoiled child of fortune. From my first entrance into life, I was accustomed to exercise command, and circumstances and the force of my own character were such that as soon as I became possessed of power, I acknowledged no master and obeyed no laws except those of my own creating." Friday, November 1st. Today, the weather being very fine, the emperor went out about 2 o'clock. After walking a little in the garden, he felt fatigued and called at Madame Bertrand's to rest himself. He sat there upwards of an hour in an armchair without saying a word, and apparently suffering much from pain and weakness. He then returned languidly to his chamber, where he threw himself on his sofa and fell into a slumber. As he did on the preceding day, I was very much distressed to observe the state of extreme debility to which he was reduced. He endeavored to overcome his drowsiness, but he could neither converse nor read. I withdrew in order that he might take a little rest. An English frigate arrived from the Cape on her way to Europe. This circumstance has afforded us an opportunity of writing to our friends. I have, however, denied myself the happiness of doing so, for the repeated complaints of the governor, together with the consequences with which I was threatened, amount to an absolute prohibition of all correspondence with Europe. Perhaps a more favorable moment may arrive. At all events, I must be patient. Dr. O'Meara called to see my son, who continued in a very precarious state. He was again bled yesterday and fainted 3 or 4 times in the course of the day. The doctor took the opportunity of speaking to me on the subject of the emperor's health, and he assured me that he was by no means free of alarm as to the consequences of his confinement. He said he was continually urging the necessity of exercise, and he begged that I would endeavor to prevail on the emperor to go out more frequently. It was obvious that an alarming change had taken place in him. The doctor did not hesitate to affirm that such complete confinement after a life of activity would be attended with the worst consequences, for that any serious disorder produced by the nature of the climate, or any accident to which he might be exposed, would infallibly prove fatal to him. These words and the tone of anxiety in which they were uttered deeply affected me. From that moment I observed the sincere interest which the doctor felt for Napoleon, and of which he has since afforded so many proofs. The emperor sent for me about 6 o'clock. He was taking a bath, and he appeared to be worse than when I had last seen him. This he attributed to going out yesterday. He, however, experienced some benefit from the bath, and he took up Lord Macartney's embassy to China, which he continued reading for some time, making various observations as he proceeded. When he laid aside the book, he began to converse on the situation of the French prisoners in England. Was one of the subjects that happened to come under discussion. I will here put together some remarks on this subject that fell from the emperor on the present and other occasions. The sudden rupture of the Treaty of Amiens on such false pretenses, and with so much bad faith on the part of the English ministry, greatly irritated the first consul, who conceived that he had been trifled with. The seizure of several French merchant ships, even before war had been declared, roused his indignation to the utmost. To my urgent remonstrances, said the emperor, they coolly replied that it was a practice they had always observed, and here they spoke the truth. But the time was gone by when France could tamely submit to such injustice and humiliation. I had become the defender of her rights and glory, and I was resolved to let our enemies know with whom they had to deal. Unfortunately, owing to the reciprocal situation of the two countries, I could only avenge one act of violence by another still greater. It was a painful thing to be compelled to make reprisals on innocent men, but I had no alternative. On reading the ironical and insolent reply that was returned to my complaints, I that very night issued an order for arresting in every part of France and in every territory occupied by the French all Englishmen of every rank whatever, and detaining them as prisoners by way of reprisal for the unjust seizure of our ships. Most of these English were men of rank and fortune who were traveling for their pleasure. But the more extraordinary the measure, the greater the injustice, the better it suited my purpose. A general outcry was raised. The English appealed to me, but I referred them to their own government, on whose conduct alone their fate depended. Several of these individuals proposed raising a subscription to pay for the ships that had been seized in the hope of thereby obtaining permission to return home. I, however, informed them that I did not want money, but merely to obtain justice and redress for an injury. Could it have been believed that the English government, as crafty and tenacious with respect to its maritime rights, as the court of Rome is in its religious pretensions, suffered a numerous and distinguished class of Englishmen to be unjustly detained for 10 years, rather than authentically renounced for the future an odious system of maritime plunder? When I was first raised to the head of the consular government, I had a misunderstanding with the English cabinet on the subject of prisoners of war, but I now carried my point. The Directory had been weak enough to agree to an arrangement extremely injurious to France and entirely to the advantage of England. The English maintained their prisoners in France, and we had to maintain ours in England. We had but few English prisoners, and the French prisoners in England were exceedingly numerous. Provisions were to be had almost for nothing in France, and they were exorbitantly dear in England. Thus the English had very trifling expenses to defray, while we, on the other hand, had to send enormous sums into a foreign country, and that at a time when we could but ill afford it. This arrangement, moreover, required an exchange of agents between the respective countries, and the English commissioner proved to be neither more nor less than a spy on the French government. He was the go-between and contriver of the plots that were hatched in the interior of France by the emigrants abroad. No sooner was I made acquainted with this state of things, and I erased the abuse by a stroke of the pen. The English government was informed that thenceforward each country must maintain the prisoners it should make unless an exchange were agreed upon. A terrible outcry was raised, and a threat was held out that the French prisoners should be suffered to die of starvation. I doubted not that the English ministers were sufficiently obstinate and inhuman to wish to put this threat into execution, but I knew that any cruelty exercised towards the prisoners would be repugnant to the feelings of the nation. The English government yielded the point. The situation of our unfortunate prisoners was indeed neither better nor worse than it had previously been, but in other respects we gained great advantages and got rid of an arrangement which placed us under a sort of yoke and tribute. During the whole of the war, I incessantly made proposals for an exchange of prisoners, but to this the English government, under some pretense or other, constantly refused to accede on the supposition that it would be advantageous to me. I have nothing to say against this. In war, policy must take place of feeling, but why exercise unnecessary cruelty? And this is what the English ministers unquestionably did when they found the number of prisoners increasing. Then commenced for our unfortunate countrymen the odious system of confinement in hulks, a species of torture which the ancients would have added to the horrors of the infernal regions. Had their imaginations been capable of conceiving it, I readily admit that there might be an exaggeration on the part of the accusers, but was the truth spoken by those who defended themselves? We know what kind of thing a report to Parliament is. One can form a correct idea of it when we read the calumnies and falsehoods that are uttered in Parliament with such cool effrontery by the base men who have blushed not to become our executioners. Confinement on board hulks is a thing that needs no explanation. The fact speaks for itself when it is considered that men unaccustomed to live on shipboard were crowded together in little unwholesome cabins, too small to afford them room to move, that by way of indulgence they were permitted twice during the 24 hours to breathe pestilential exhalations at ebb tide, and that this misery was prolonged for the space of 10 or 12 years. The blood curdles at such an odious picture of inhumanity. On this point, I blame myself for not having made reprisals. It would have been well had I thrown into similar confinement not the poor sailors and soldiers whose complaints would never have been attended to, but all the English nobility and persons of fortune who were then in France. I should have permitted them to maintain free correspondence with their friends and families, and their complaints would soon have assailed the ears of the English ministers and checked their odious measures. Certain parties in Paris, who were ever the best allies of the enemy, would, of course, have called me a tiger and a cannibal, but no matter. I should discharge my duty to the French people, who had made me their protector and defender. In this instance, my decision of character failed me. The emperor asked me whether the French prisoners had been confined in hulks at the time when I was in England. I could not positively inform him, but I replied that I did not think they were, because I knew they were prisons for them in various parts of the country, where many of the English visited them and purchased the productions of their industry. I added that they were, in all probability, but ill provided for and exposed to many hardships. For a story used to be told of a government agent having visited one of the prisons on horseback, and no sooner had he alighted from his horse and turned his back than the poor animal was seized, cut to pieces, and devoured by the prisoners. I did not, of course, vouch for the fact, but the story was related by the English themselves, and the ignorant and prejudiced class did not regard it as a proof of the extreme misery to which the prisoners must have been reduced, but merely as an example of their terrible voracity. The emperor laughed and said he considered the anecdotes to be a mere fabrication, observing that if the fact were to be relied on, it was calculated to make human nature shudder, for that nothing but hunger urged to madness could drive men to such a dreadful extremity. I was the more inclined to believe that the plan of confinement on board the hulks had not been introduced when I was in England, because I recollected that a great deal had been said about establishing the French prisoners in some small islands between England and Ireland. It was proposed to convey them thither and to leave them to themselves in a state of complete seclusion, and a few light vessels were to be kept constantly cruising about to guard them. To this plan it was, however, objected that in case of a descent on the part of the enemy, his grand object would be to land on these islands, distribute arms among the prisoners, and thus recruit an army immediately. Perhaps, added I, this idea might have led to the use of hogs, for the prisoners were rapidly increasing in numbers, and it was not thought safe to keep them on shore among the people, as the latter betrayed a strong disposition to fraternize with the French. Well, said Napoleon, I can very readily conceive that there might be good grounds for rejecting the plan you have just mentioned, safety and self-preservation before all things, but the confinement in the hulks is a stain on the English character for humanity, an irritating sting that will never be removed from the hearts of the French prisoners. On the subject of prisoners of war, continued Napoleon, the English ministers invariably acted with their habitual bad faith and with the Machiavellianism that distinguishes the school of the present day, being absolutely determined to avoid an exchange which they did not wish to incur the blame of having refused. They invented a multiplied pretense beyond calculation. In the first place, that I should presume to regard as prisoners persons merely detained was affirmed to be an atrocious violation of the laws of civilized nations, and a principle which the English government would never avow on any consideration whatever. It happened that some of the individuals detained who were at large on parole escaped and were received triumphantly in England. On the other hand, some Frenchmen effected their escape to France. I expressed my disapprobation of their conduct and proposed that the individuals of either country who had thus broken their parole should be mutually sent back again. But I received for answer that persons detained were not to be accounted prisoners, that they had merely availed themselves of the lawful privileges of escaping oppression, that they had done right and had been received accordingly. After this, I thought myself justified in inducing the French to escape, and the English ministers filled their journals with the most insolent abuse, declaring me to be a man who scrupled not to violate moral principle, faith, or law. When at length they determined to treat for an exchange of prisoners, or perhaps I ought rather to say, when they took it into their heads to trifle with me on this point, they sent a commissioner to France. All the great difficulties were waived, and with a fine parade of sentiments, conditions were proposed for the sake of humanity. They consented to include persons detained in a list of prisoners, and to admit under the head the Hanoverian troops who were my prisoners, but who were at large on parole. This latter point had been a standing obstacle because it was insinuated that Hanoverians were not English. Thus far, matters had proceeded smoothly, and there was every probability of their being brought to a conclusion. But I knew whom I had to deal with, and I guessed the intentions that were really entertained. There were infinitely more French prisoners in English than English prisoners in France, and I was well aware that the English being once safely landed at home, some pretense would be found for breaking off the exchange, and the rest of my poor Frenchmen might have remained on board the hulks to all eternity. I declared that I would accede to no partial exchange, that I would be satisfied only with a full and complete one, and to facilitate matters, I made the following proposal. I admitted that there were fewer English prisoners in France than French prisoners in England, but I observed that there were among my prisoners Spaniards, Portuguese, and other allies of the English who had been taken under their banners and fighting in the same cause. With this addition, I could on my part produce a far more considerable number of prisoners than were in England. I therefore offered to surrender up all in return for all. This proposition at first occasioned some embarrassment. It was discussed and rejected. However, as soon as they had devised a scheme by which they could secure the object they had in view, they acceded to my proposition. But I kept a watchful eye on them. I knew that if we began by merely exchanging Frenchmen for Englishmen, as soon as the latter should be secured, pretenses would be found for breaking off the business, and the old evasions would be resumed. For the English prisoners in France did not amount to 1/3 of the French in England. To obviate any misunderstanding on either side, I therefore proposed that we should exchange by transports of only 3,000 at a time, that 3,000 Frenchmen should be returned to me, and then I would send back 1,000 English and 2,000 Hanoverians, Spaniards, and Portuguese, and others. Thus, if any misunderstanding arose and put a stop to the exchange, we should still stand in the same relative proportions as before, and without having practiced any deception upon each other. But if, on the contrary, the affair should proceed uninterruptedly to a conclusion, I promised to surrender up gratuitously all the prisoners that might ultimately remain in my hands. My conjectures respecting the real designs of the English government proved to be correct. These conditions, which were really so reasonable, and the principle of which had already been adopted, were rejected, and the whole business was broken off. Whether the English ministers really sympathized in the situation of their countrymen, or whether they were convinced of my firm determination not to be duped, I know not, but it would appear that they were at length inclined to come to a conclusion when I subsequently introduced the subject by an indirect channel. However, our disasters in Russia at once revived their hopes and defeated my intentions. The emperor next remarked upon the treatment of prisoners of war in France, which he said was as generous and liberal as it possibly could be, and he thought that on this subject no nation could justly convey a reproach to us. We have, said he, in our favor the testimony and the sentiments of the prisoners themselves, for with the exception of those who were ardently attached to their local laws, or in other words, to notions of liberty, and these were exclusively the English and Spaniards, all the rest, namely the Austrians, Prussians, and Russians, were willing to remain with us. They left us with regret and returned to us with pleasure. This disposition on the part of the Spaniards and English has oftener than once influenced the obstinacy of their efforts or their resistance. The emperor also made the following observation. It was my intention to have introduced into Europe a change with respect to the treatment of prisoners. I intended to enroll them in regiments and to make them labor under military discipline at public works and monuments. They should have received whatever money they earned and would thus have been secured against the misery of absolute idleness and the disorders arising out of it. They would have been well fed and clothed and would have wanted for nothing without being a burden on the state. All parties would have been benefited by this plan, but my idea did not meet the approval of the Council of State, which in this instance was swayed by the mistaken philanthropy that leads to so many errors in the world. It was said that it would be unjust and cruel to compel men to labor. It was feared lest our enemies should make reprisals, and it was affirmed that a prisoner was sufficiently unfortunate in the loss of his liberty without being placed under restraint as to the employment of his time. But here was the abuse of which I complained, and which I wished to correct. As a prisoner, said I, must and should expect to be placed under lawful constraint, and that which I would impose on him is for his own advantage as well as that of others. I do not require that he should be subject to greater misery or fatigue, but to less danger than he is exposed to in his present condition. You are afraid lest the enemy should make reprisals and treat French prisoners in the same manner. Heaven grant it should be so. I wish for nothing better. I should then behold my sailors and soldiers occupied in wholesome labor in the fields or the public roads, instead of seeing them buried alive on board those odious hulks. They would return home healthy and industrious and inured to labor, and in every country they would leave behind them some compensation for the fatal ravages of war. By way of concession, the Council of State agreed to the organization of a few corps of prisoners as voluntary laborers or something of the sort, but this was by no means the fulfillment of the scheme I had in view. The second, the emperor did not leave his chamber today. When I waited on him, I found him very unwell from the effects of cold, and the secretion of saliva still continued. I remained with him the greater part of the day. He sometimes endeavored to converse and sometimes tried to sleep. He was very restless and often drew near the fire. He was evidently feverish. In the course of the day, the conversation turned upon Antwerp, its arsenals, its fortifications, its importance, and the great military and political views he entertained with respect to that favorably situated place.